Okay, wonderful. Thank you back, everybody. I should say thank you for coming back. Welcome back. We'd now like to welcome our next presenters from the Government of Canada. We have Ms. Kaveri Machanda, who is Chief within the Standards Division at Statistics Canada, and Mr. David Hartnett, who is Senior Research Advisor from the Labour Market Information Directorate at Employment and Social Development Canada. Both Statistics Canada and Employment and Social Development Canada have co-developed and currently maintain Canada's National Occupational Classification System, also more commonly known as the NOC. Occupational information is of critical importance to the provision of labor market and career intelligence, skills development, occupational forecasting, labor supply and demand analysis, employment equity, and numerous other programs and services. The NOC provides a standardized framework for organizing the world of work in a manageable, understandable, and coherent system. Both Kaveri and David and their respective teams and departments have also recognized the importance of going beyond traditional occupational descriptions to discuss the changing skills requirements of Canadian occupations. For this reason, they are here today to present the Government of Canada's Skills and Competencies Taxonomy as one of the ways governments, industry stakeholders, educational institutions, and others can begin to capture and more clearly define their digital skill needs. So, a note they didn't give me, I just want to point out, we did not plan this, but a central theme of discussion so far today has been growing around definitions and taxonomy. So I think this is going to be a wonderful presentation to wrap up the day with. We're going to have plenty of time for discussion after. So I hope you will participate in that. And for now, please welcome David and Kaveri.
Great, thank you. So we'd first like to thank our colleagues at ISED for organizing this seminar. We're very informative thus far. Also want to thank Dr. Gray, Tacit Elements, for helping us frame the digital conversation here over the course of the seminar. And we'll be touching on some of these concepts that the perceived digital skills gap report touched on in terms of basics, digital skills, advanced digital skills, digital intelligence. That'll come up. And also like to acknowledge the work being done across the country. Many interesting presenters today. We heard about government programs running on to train individuals in Nova Scotia, 860 individuals in Nova Scotia on digital skills. Sectors organizing to understand and respond to their own digital skills needs. So that was our lunchtime speaker. As well as I think Digital Skills Nova Scotia, there was a rep from the association talking about a patchwork of skills that are needed to succeed. And so we're here representing Employment Social Development Canada and Statistics Canada. I'm going to start us off, and I'm not monopolizing the microphone. Kaveri's going to join me in a few minutes. And so just to give you a sense of what we'll be talking about today, a question we're often asked is how can ESDC and Statistics Canada better support the conversation around skills acquisition, skills application. Obviously, the purpose of this event is digital skills acquisition, application, and identification within occupations. So we're going to present today the NOC, the National Occupational Classification, as well as a number of other frameworks to help talk through digital skills application, and we're using occupations to ground the conversation. So standard frameworks, classifications. Also, we want to make sure that the frameworks and the classifications are reflective of the current labor market realities. That's a challenge for governments, obviously. We need to consult. We need to go back to industry, to education. We need to understand, in real time as much as possible how skills requirements are changing. And so sometimes our classifications, people feel that they're not reflective of today's needs. So we obviously take that constructive feedback, and we're trying to find mechanisms to be more responsive. And finally, looking at continuous ways of collecting information on digital skills. So today we'll be touching on 4 different classifications and products. So the NOC, the Career Handbook, which is often called the Career Counseling or the Employment Counseling brother or sister of the NOC. It kind of goes into more skills details. The Essential Skills Framework, so we've heard the essential skills mentioned a few times during today's presentations. So there is a framework that was established 20 years ago on the essential skills. Describe those for you today. And finally, a new product that we're looking at called the Skills and Competencies Taxonomy. And again, that's the whole idea of a skills dictionary to help maybe get everybody on the same page in terms of talking through some of these skills challenges, including digital skills. And so the NOC is Canada's official system for organizing, describing occupations in the labor market. How many people have heard of the NOC? There we go. It's applied widely. There's 35,000 job titles that are grouped under 500 unit groups, and they each have a 4-digit code corresponding to the group's type of work and skill level. The NOC is used to classify responses in statistical surveys, and Cavriel will be touching on this a little bit later, such as the census of population, the labor force surveys, and others. Obviously, there's a standardized classification system has its advantages in terms of collecting, compiling, analyzing longitudinal data on the labor market. So having that kind of stable framework has proven helpful in just kind of getting a snapshot over time of the labor market. And as I've mentioned, one of the shortfalls of that is the more stable the classification is, the less we can kind of mess at the margins in terms of changing it at the rapid rate of technological evolution, because obviously you've got a qualitative side that needs to evolve continuously, and then on the quantitative side, we want to keep this statistical time series as stable as possible to be able to tell that story. And the NOC supports a variety of programs, including the National Job Bank, the EI system, employment insurance, and immigration programs. Now, I mentioned the Career Handbook, which is a derivative product of the NOC, often called the career counseling or employment counseling component of the NOC. And the Career Handbook was last updated in 2003, and we'll come back to that later in the presentation. But basically, it takes the 500 NOC codes, doubles that number to about close to 1,000 occupational profiles, and then maps the skills DNA of those occupational profiles. So it's a massive, massive undertaking, and that's why it's taken so long for us to kind of go back to the Career Handbook and think about, hey, how have the skills, I call it the DNA, the skills DNA of occupations, how has it changed over time? How will we go about collecting that information and updating that information? So the taxonomy that I'm going to talk about is directly related to updating the Career Handbook. Now, the essential skills framework. So 20 years ago, the Government of Canada wanted to identify skills, key skills that were needed for work, for life, and for learning. And so the 9 skills that they came up with were reading, writing, oral communication, numeracy, document use, thinking, digital technology, at the time it was called computer use, working with others, and continuous learning. And so the interesting thing about the essential skills is they were defined at the time as the foundation for learning all other skills. So we talked about building that base before you can build higher order skills. And they also help people evolve with their jobs and adapt to workplace change. So if we're saying that the economy is changing at a rapid pace, we may want to take a closer look at the essential skills, and there's digital technology as part of that. So if that's a foundational piece, perhaps we should give more thought to those skills. And as I mentioned, needless to say, the incidence and the application of digital technology over the last 20 years may not make some of that information may not be relevant within the essential skills profiles, but we'll touch on that in a few minutes. Which takes us to the skills and competencies taxonomy. And so in reflecting on ways to update our various products, we talked about the NOC, the Career Handbook, the Essential Skills Framework. It became clear that skills and competency data was being collected, disseminated in very different ways by very different organizations. So can we differentiate between the concepts of skills and competencies? Can we differentiate between the concepts of basic skills, foundational skills, core literacy skills, the essential skills, right? Are we just playing with synonyms, or can we actually differentiate between these terms? Same thing with technical versus technological skills. And once again, with popular terms that group sets of skills. So we heard soft skills mentioned earlier, very, very popular in the literature. Global competencies, that is another term. 21st century skills. What do we mean when we say 21st century skills? And hard skills. I heard somebody mention hard skills earlier. I was at an event in Montreal not too long ago, and a gentleman came up and said, hard skills, hard to identify and hard to train to. And I was like, okay. And so what did we do? So we did an environmental scan of other taxonomies, frameworks in Canada and abroad. We looked at the OECD Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies, PIAC. We looked at the PISA, Program for International Assessment of Students. The Council of Education and Ministers of Canada, the World Economic Forum, provincial territorial frameworks. We really did our homework, tried to kind of see best practices that were being applied in terms of how different groups, governments were classifying skills, knowledge, abilities, interests. The list goes on. And we were largely influenced by the American ONET system, and I'd say that that's considered the gold standard in terms of mapping that skills DNA to occupations. The American ONET system, O*NET. If you haven't had a chance to Google that, take a look. And what we came up with was we wanted to talk about how all these concepts interrelated with one another. So if you see at the base, you've got abilities and personal attributes. And we started consulting in 2017 on the taxonomy, and what we heard from the career counseling community was that abilities were defined as enduring attributes, capacities that influence the acquisition of knowledge, skills, and skills to perform a job. So they were put at the base, along with the essential skills. And then from there, once you had that kind of stable pyramid, then you could develop other technical skills, more job-specific skills, higher order skills. And so we started building these. And then at the top of the pyramid, we put work activities, because what we found was that often people aren't even talking about skills, they're talking about specific work activities. So, an employer might not say, I think Dr. Gray made the point earlier where he was saying an employer may assume that some of those core skills the individual already has, and so they'll jump right into the work activity. The ability to market our products to our client base using social media, that's a work activity. So we found that a lot of employers were talking in terms of work activities and tasks. They were jumping to it, so be interested to hear from the crowd on that when we do our breakout sessions. And so we came up with this beautiful placemat, which is the skills and competency taxonomy as it exists today. So we've got 7 categories plus an 8th on tools and technology. I know it's a lot of information in one shot. The taxonomy has 7 families: skills, abilities, personal attributes, knowledge, interests, work context, work activities, and a tools and technology column at the end. And in a few minutes, we'll talk about how they kind of interplay between one another. I'm hoping that it doesn't seem like too much of an academic exercise. We're hoping that there will be a real-time application components to this, and that you'll find value in it. The taxonomy contains 400 terms within these families, each with their own definition, and each we're hoping are mutually exclusive from other concepts. Okay, so that's a challenge all in its own, because different individuals may have different conceptions, but 400 terms with their own definitions within these. And what we're hoping is that the taxonomy can be used as a translator document. Because it's a dictionary, we're not claiming for this to be another framework. We heard about our Heather from the cyber group earlier, that the sector organized to really talk about, have a cyber security conversation. What we're hoping is this taxonomy will allow different groups, governments, associations to say, we have a framework in cyber, we know of other frameworks in other industries, can we use this as a translator document? So when you use words like I said earlier, soft skills in your context, can you use this to define what you mean by soft skills? And can the other sector use the same terminology to define what they mean in their area? So a little bit about keeping up with the constant evolution of the labor market. ESDC, in partnership with Statistics Canada, we update the NOC to reflect current labor market dynamics. An ongoing challenge, as I've mentioned before, is the balance in needing to maintain a consistent structure for statistical purposes with the need to stay up to date with labor market changes. The NOC has traditionally kept up its updates with census cycles. That's every 10 years, changing the structure of the NOC. And on the content side, so you take a specific NOC code, you go in, you want to change a main duty. That was being updated every 5 years. But we're recognizing that those practices are not meeting the needs of today's labor market, not even close. So we are actually updating the NOC now on a regular basis. If you were to check our website right now, it was last updated in 2017. So we're hoping to move towards a more annual set of updates to the NOC. One last point that I think you'll find interesting, members in the room here today, is we're developing a collaborative platform. It's a new way to consult with stakeholders. And so the collaborative platform will allow, we can have a chat about how to have access to the collaborative platform. Should go live over the next year. We want to have our stakeholder networks go directly into the NOC, directly into the sections that need updating, and suggest some suggestions directly related to specific sections of the NOC. How are the educational requirements, how have they changed in New Brunswick compared to BC? How are we seeing automation playing a role in a particular profile? You'll be able to go directly into the NOC and make suggestions, and then the government will be able to take that information, validate that information, go back out to industry and say, hey, we have a critical mass here flagging a change. So I think that we're using technology in-house as well to try to facilitate our conversation, along with our regular surveys, online consultations. Those will continue to exist. Now, focusing a little more on digital skills and some of the questions, challenges that we face with classification structures. So know that the NOC captures some occupations traditionally seen as digital, so namely the ICT-related occupations. So we call them minor groups. So some NOC codes may be familiar to you if you're working in ICT occupations, 217s and the 218s. So you have your software engineers and designers, your computer programmers, your web developers in the 217345 areas. But as Dr. Gray mentioned, we have to be careful of the hegemony of digital skills in the ICT sector, and we know that ICT is permeating all sectors. So we're really cognizant of that, and we're really paying attention to other NOC codes that we know are evolving through the use of technology. I'll give you one example, but I'm sure you could throw many others at me. Graphic designers and illustrators. So the graphic designer and illustrator code is found in the arts and culture section of the NOC, separate from the 2000s. It's found in the 5000s under arts and culture, right? Because traditionally you wanted to conceptualize, produce artwork in the past, right? How did you do that? There's some mention in the NOC about using CAD, computer assistant design programs, that kind of thing, but it's kind of too lightweight to reflect the graphic designer realities of today, and that's what we're hearing from Canadian industry. So they're telling us, you gotta move the graphic designer code over with the ICT occupations. But before we do that, we're really thinking about the permeation of digital skills across all 500 codes. So before we crack open the classification, we want to consult on the best way to present the advent of rapid digital digital technologies influence across all occupations. So just something to think about. On the essential skills profiles front, so I mentioned that the Government of Canada identified those 9 skills. Again, starting 20 or so odd years ago, the Government of Canada developed the essential skills profiles across 350 plus NOCs. So they took a NOC code and they mapped how the 9 essential skills would be reflected in that NOC code. And so something where they were kind of advanced at the time is they not only looked at the incidence of a skill within an occupation, they also looked at the level of complexity at which different tasks in those occupations might be performed. So that's the kind of neat 5-point scale that we see at the bottom. So we've heard some stats again from this morning's presentation about, operating at a level 1, operating at a level 2, operating at a level 3. Essential skills, the way they were designed, they weren't just basic skills. Every skill was looked at on a continuum from basic to advanced. So, if you take reading, the skill of reading as an example, level 1, 2, 3 might be your, learning to read. And then once you move from level 3 on to 5, it's reading to learn. So you have the base and suddenly you can start to use it to great advantage. So I think that there's value in, again, looking at these. The purpose of today's presentation is just to make you aware that these tools and frameworks are out there, they're available. They can help us advance these types of conversations. And now on to the taxonomy. So some refer to an actual skill when talking about digital skills. Others refer to a digital skill as a work activity or a tool in technology. Or they pull in a set of complementary skills, abilities, personal attributes, or knowledge that individuals require to perform a task. This is coming back to some of the definitional issues that we talked about earlier today. Once you start to unpack digital skills, you can take it in many different directions. And so, you remember this beautiful placemat? I turned it into a keyboard. Okay, so let's just test. This is what I meant by a practical application of what we're talking about. So take the work activity of coding, okay? So some have called coding a skill. But let's say you really see coding as a work activity. So you're telling a computer how to perform a complex task. So according to the placemat, that falls in the work activity section. In order to perform that activity, you need a tool or technology, a programming language. So we heard about Python. So when you're talking through it, you could say, okay, the work activity of coding, using the tool and technology of the Python software. Then you get maybe into a general knowledge base. This might be an academic field of study, depending on the level of expertise you need in that area. So the knowledge of information systems, do you need a formal academic background to be able to perform the skill? This is something that we layer in terms of the knowledge category of that placemat I showed you. Cognitive abilities. So we talked about they're at the base of that pyramid I showed you earlier, capacities that influence the acquisition of knowledge and skills. So general learning ability, the ability to catch on to concepts, pattern recognition. These are the types of abilities that are found in the taxonomy. And then finally, you layer it in with the skill of problem solving, which is back to an essential skill as defined by the framework of the essential skills. So can you ID problems, develop options, implement solutions? So suddenly we're playing beautiful music. You're drawing on a number of the categories found in the taxonomy to tell the story, to unpack what you mean by the digital skills. So again, we'll have a chance to talk about these things at our tables later, but this is just to give you an idea of how the taxonomy could be used. Towards a digital skills framework. So we have here a number of frameworks that are in existence. Dr. Gray, we gave you a shout out with the red box at the bottom. Basic skills, advanced digital skills, digital intelligence. So there are many, many different ways to perceive our understanding of digital skills. Different frameworks, we talked about them internationally. The European Commission has a really great digital skills framework. In Canada, the Government of Canada is thinking about this taxonomy as a way to kind of, I think my Director General called it the Rosetta Stone of products, to kind of just help create that, that ability for people to translate different frameworks using the same language. And I'm just about to turn it over to Kaveri, but I just want to mention really quickly, so the career handbook I mentioned, it's that counseling component of the NOC. We need information today. So obviously we know that there are major investments coming with the Office of Future Skills. I said there are major investments in place to invest in the future of skills. We do need information right now. So the career handbook, what we're hoping over the next year is to do that update to those occupational profiles and start talking about what is the incidence of these skills within an occupation, what's the frequency of use of a skill within an occupation, what's the level of proficiency needed. This gets pretty technical, but there are people thinking about this, and we want to draw on surveys. There, we mentioned in the U.S. they have they survey 25,000 job incumbents every year on a section of their occupational classification. So we're hoping to draw on that information to really tell a story and to have a handbook that Canadian employers, governments can use and reference in terms of that detailed skills information. And the terms that will be used will be based on the taxonomy. That's one of the reasons why we created it. Kaveri.
Hi, I'm Kaveri Mechanda, and I'll just do one last slide before we get to questions and discussions. I think it's been a long day, and we've had a lot of interesting talk. So, so Statistics Canada provides information on Canada's economy and society, and to enable us to do this, we need classifications that are well organized, well structured, classes that are mutually exclusive, and also things that, I guess, concepts that allow us to understand what's going on in the economy. And so Statistics Canada also has a vested interest in developing the skills lexicon, so we're working with our colleagues on that. And to help guide the collection and gathering of data via on skills, via surveys, and other alternative sources of information. So we have the STEM and BASE grouping classification and variant of SIP. Okay, what was that? The classification of instructional programs is a classification of the fields of study. So we have a classification that encompasses all of the university, all of the post-secondary education given. So we're very good at getting all the university education, classifying all of the university education, all of the college-based education. Right now, we're looking at how do we code cannabis data, because now we're getting information on cannabis courses that have started up, for example. And the education sector catches up very fast with industry, because if there's demand, they can make money there. We got that, but we're also, we've already developed for that a STEM grouping, a STEM base, meaning what is not STEM. So we don't want to call it non-STEM, it's all the other, it's a base. So STEM refers to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So it's, hi, okay, can everybody hear me? Yeah, and if you couldn't hear me before, do I have to repeat anything? No, good, thank you. So STEM fields of study, and this is based on the STEM fields of study developed in the United States. In fact, we partner with the United States in developing the classification of instructional programs, and my colleagues are just today in the United States working with them in developing SIP. So if you look at the education context, we already have this a STEM, not STEM, and we were very conservative in what was STEM. So it's an education in the core areas of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But when we get to occupation, it gets more tricky in terms of saying what is STEM, what is not STEM. Because in the area of occupation, we have STEM based on education. So but you may not be doing research further developing that field. Like a theoretical mathematician is developing the field of mathematics. but an engineer is usually applying what they've already learned. So you have high knowledge versus applying versus developing, and then you have also the level of application. So do you know enough to use software? Do you know enough to design and be creative? So if you go back to the example of graphic design that my colleague just used, it's at first glance, they're very, 20 years ago, if you could do a good illustration and be very creative and know what the market wants, great. But now you need to know graphic design software. You can use package programs where you're just, taking tools out and using it, versus right now a lot of coding is being done, particularly, the highly animated graphics for graphic design. You're doing a lot of coding, so it's the same field, but you can see the level of digital skills needed keeps increasing and changing. And in a situation where the new hires, you're actually looking for a lot higher skills than people who are already in the area. And there's still some traditional graphic designers working away too. So Statistics Canada is developing a classification variant of the National Occupational Classification for the analysis of data by STEM occupations. So the proposed STEM occupations include, say, architecture, science managers, chemists, aerospace engineers, software engineers, designers. So you can see the wide variety there. It's not just knowledge. Oh, I should also do a little call out and say that in the skills lexicon, one of the fields was knowledge, and the classification of instructional programs is going to be used to either support or replace that, so that that way all the data we collect on the classification instructional programs can be used to support the skills lexicon. So now I'm going to go to just a quick thing to an Excel sheet of what we're developing in terms of, okay, right. Sure, how do I pull it over? So this is like a preview of where we are. Are you able to do that? Oh, okay.
It's not sending to.
But it's not coming. Okay. In the meantime, I'll describe
Can I
it.
speak to the
Huh?
mic?
Oh yeah. In the meantime, I'll just describe it. So what we have is showing the relationship between the education classification of instructional programs and the occupation classification that we're trying to develop. So we're trying to see what is STEM and what is not STEM. And okay, so so some of it is obvious. If you just from the definition of the acronyms for STEM, science, the people in the fields of science are STEM. People in technology, but here there's a problem with the technology, because if technology is everywhere, do we take all the occupations and put them in STEM? Or then how do we measure what level of technology goes into STEM and what doesn't? And it's becoming more and more a problem, as we heard, additional technologies everywhere. Engineering. So engineering, okay, clearly part of STEM. We also, in the classification of instructional programs, have something called architectural engineering. So let me go, yeah. So, so architectural, so science, so the blue, you can see that's science and science technology, and we have what you would traditionally consider to be part of STEM. So we have, physicists, astronomers, chemists, and on your right side, you can see the education needed to get there. You need physical and chemical sciences, biological sciences. So these are all very traditionally, so engineering technology, which needs a lot of ICT education. And then we have, and SIP includes architectural engineering as part of engineering. So we've broken it out, but it's there. And then mathematics and computer information sciences. So that's core information technology as opposed to applied and users of information technology. Architecture and STEM post-secondary education. So these are the instructors and the professors. And here our difficulty is how do you say what is STEM and what is not STEM. If they're teaching in STEM occupations, then they're part of STEM. If they're not teaching STEM, core STEM occupations, they're not part of STEM. And we've included at the very top, I won't go there, but at the very top we've also included some of the managers of the STEM occupations, people who are highly, who usually have to have a high degree of education. For example, managers in engineering usually come up the stream in terms of their occupational pathway is usually through working as an engineer. So they would have a high degree of education in engineering before they became a manager. And so we're also looking at some sales occupations, but not all. So not all, just because you use software as part of your sales doesn't mean you're STEM right now. That's how we have it. So as I said, this is a draft we're developing. So if you have any comments, you think something should be changed, let us know. We're thinking of including a separate grouping for health occupations because there is so much applied science there. And when we started that conversation, some of our colleagues who are working on education said, well, why don't you have a STEM mixed category? And that means you'd have this core STEM, then you would have this STEM mixed, and maybe we can look at more of the applied technology area there. And then you would have this non-STEM. And so what if they're not equally divided? Maybe this will show the evolution of our economy as the non-STEM sector keeps shrinking over time. So that's what I wanted to present to you, and hopefully we'll have some good discussion about where you think what should be. We're particularly interested in where to place some of the forestry technology and some of the ocean technology type things. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. We will have plenty of opportunity for questions about this, but what we want to jump into right now is more of a guided discussion with questions and topics going back to the group. As they mentioned, both David and Kaveri, on numerous occasions, is what they're showing us right now is a work in progress. And this is a unique opportunity to get input in this process today. So we want to hear from as many stakeholders as possible along a few themes so that they can go back to their offices and get to work on doing what we tell them to do. So if ever you wanted to have your own employees do what you want, please take advantage of this opportunity to direct them. So we'll do a guided discussion and we'll save time at the end for an open discussion if you have questions specific to them. Sound great? And for all online participants, please be sure you sign in to the WebEx. Use the chat function to get in touch with Eliza, and your questions will be relayed. Again, questions are invited in both languages. Les questions, la discussion peut être soutenue dans les deux langues officielles. So please do participate. So we're going to send this one back to the floor. What value do you see in having a standardized skills and competencies taxonomy to describe your digital environment or needs? So what value do you see in having this framework, this taxonomy? That's a broad question, but. Please.
So I'm from the federal government. So a quick answer would be targeting some federal programming to specific occupations. So there's been lots of work being done to support the enrollment into STEM. and to target some classification groups. So to have a classification that would allow us to target specific groups and have more tailored programming would actually help us in terms of having better impact moving forward with our program, I think. So for us, that would definitely be something that clearly our partners that we would be looking forward to.
Perfect. Anybody else see value in their work, their approach?
I think from our perspective, I like to look at it from a research side of things so that we get a better understanding of what's available in terms of human resources or what's missing. I think it could really help us better understand the missing link in terms of is there a shortage, and also the common lexicon, how we're defining things.
Absolutely. I mean, yes.
I think from industry's perspective, it would be helpful when we're looking at how to augment skills out there. When you see government departments delivering programs and services, if we have more of a standard language that everyone is using. In my past work directly with technology companies, I found that was one of the challenges. Companies would talk about skills gaps, but they all saw them differently, they all described them differently, and then when you're trying to deliver a program, people are talking 80 different languages, so trying to design something that serves needs, I think this would certainly help.
Wonderful.
Building on what Heather was saying in terms of developing the evidence base to help support your programming and policies, with this drilling down into this sort of taxonomy, you can look at underrepresented groups. You can look at how do you target women, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, and so then you get a better handle on you know how where you can have impact. Because right now, when we talk about women in STEM, but if you look at certain fields in STEM, the women are well represented, whereas in something like engineering or ICT, they're not. So if we have a better better data, then that can better inform our policies and programs.
Yeah, so when we're talking about elaborating policies, elaborating programs, we have to have a good diagnostic, have good data. I think one of the preoccupations we have also is a capacity to benchmark. So we need to have the same taxonomy so we can compare each other within Canada and with other countries, other states. So that's a big challenge, and if I had a homework to give you, that would be to make sure that we can compare each other.
Mm. I mean, and to reiterate some of this, I mean, this, do you see value in the standardized skills and competencies taxonomy? To go back to my researcher hat and not facilitator, absolutely. I think what you're doing right now, this standardized approach, is of the most fundamental importance in what we're trying to do today in this seminar. That if we're trying to build economy-wide, nationwide collaboration, communication around skills for the future, we cannot do that if we don't speak the same language between government, between industry, between regional development agencies, between consultants, between academics, and that's effectively what a standardized skills and competencies taxonomy is. I mean, we'll keep going through these questions and this discussion and your process, and you might make tweaks to it, but the idea of having a national standardized taxonomy that applies to all industries and it's updated every year, I don't know how we do anything that we're saying we're trying to do without that as a foundation. I mean, this is a keystone element from a research, from an industry perspective. So I applaud you in what you're trying to do. I see some of your stuff. I don't envy you. By all means, I do not. I'm glad you're doing it and not me. I'll make use of it. And just make sure you get it right, okay? Anybody else? Does anyone think that maybe we're putting just too much emphasis on shared language taxonomy? Then that means I'm going to say unanimous consent. This is critical importance. Keep doing the work you're doing. I'm not saying you're going in the right direction, but you're trying. So maybe from the next question, we'll see if we can get to things. People in the room, people online. Oh, also people online, we haven't received any questions yet, and we have Adrian in the room who's tasked with running to the mic. I would like to see him put on a few miles today. So please, even if you don't want the answer, just send him something. He's been sitting there way too calm all day. So, do you see yourselves using the taxonomy? If so, how?
I think hopefully after tomorrow and in some of our conversations, we'll be able to use the taxonomy. Right now for ocean technology, it's not fitting a lot of the roles that we have. A lot of the roles that are rolling up under sort of advanced manufacturing type of roles, and so it's not really fitting. And I'm just speaking from my industry. And also, you know, again, because it's small, medium-sized companies, a lot of the positions that exist right now are a little bit of this and a little bit of that and some more of this over here. I'd love to see some way of, I'm not sure how we're going to do that. Hopefully this is part of the discussion tomorrow. But I think it would definitely help to, you know, do the count of, you know, how many people are out there with these particular or in these roles, or you know, being able to more clearly define what we're looking for going forward in the industry. I think it's going to add huge value for us. Yeah.
Wonderful. Anyone else see themselves using this? Okay, I'm going to jump in again. As a researcher, I use this all the time. We do a bunch of economic impact assessments, industry planning. I turn to the existing NOx system. I look forward to the updates. I love it. As a business, I'm sorry to say, I will not turn to that to create job vacancy announcements and job postings. It's a level of detail that is just so far beyond the common discussion that I don't connect with people. So on the research side, I love the detail. On the daily application side, as a business owner, it's almost too much for me to be able to engage in a meaningful understanding with the person I'm trying to speak to. Because not everyone makes a distinction, as you were saying, skill, competency, ability, work, activity, that, again, from the research side, we absolutely need this data. Do not stop doing what you're doing. But from an application side, as a business owner, I'm lost. If I turn to this to advertise a posting for a research assistant, I don't know where I'm going, to be honest. If you want to talk to that, yeah.
So I'm not sure I have the answer, but one of the things that we're looking at as well is kind of more user-friendly applications. So the taxonomy might be running in the background, right? Running in the background, and you'd have these kind of client-facing interfaces for guidance counselors, for employment counselors, where they could type in some information about the client, and then, you know, continue to ask those questions through the employment benefits and support measures programming in the provinces and territories that represents close to $3 billion of skills investments in Canada. You know, the employment counselors would continue to do their work with the clients. They might be asking some of those questions, but what we're hoping is, no matter what kind of language is used, we could map it back. You know, so somebody says working with others, somebody says collaboration, somebody says teamwork. You know, somebody says, no, it's interpersonal, you've got it all wrong. You know, we're hoping that we can map it back through common definitions, right? Like, and obviously there'll be a lot of AI and a lot of algorithms running and a lot of upfront formula development. But if we can reach that point, you know, where we can, governments can start harnessing the idea of machine learning and that kind of thing, and moving beyond just synonyms, but like sense making. This is really like where the literature is going in terms of that kind of skills mapping the conversations, and internationally. How do we find a way where no matter what the language, because the language is outpacing our ability to keep up, right? And that includes on the definitions, right? To have definitions that match. And I was happy, it was Sherry, I was happy to hear on the ocean tech front where you talked about, you know, you have jobs that may need to pull a little bit from column A and pull from column B, right? There's some limitations in terms of the NOx ability to reflect those, right? Like you might be pulling on information from 2 different NOx, right? But we're open to hearing where there's friction between the boundaries of certain NOC codes. If industry, if stakeholders are telling us that, hey, there's a merger happening between distinct occupations, we'll take that information and we'll validate it, right? So that it's maybe not just specific to one or two groups, but if we're seeing it across the country, I think we'll have the ability to start to adapt to those kinds of changes in the labor market and on the skill side.
I think that's brilliant. Oh, Adrian
Question.
rises.
Yeah. Okay, so the question is, how would you envision this being used as do you envision this being used as an online app or tool to better support employer needs? So the knock in the handbook.
I'll let you take this one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Once again, I know we have colleagues who are kind of looking at ways to make it kind of more accessible on mobile applications, that kind of thing. We know that there recently, if you've been on the Job Bank, the Job Bank has a mobile app that just got released through ESDC. And you know, I think it's beyond user testing. It's live, and it's being used across the country for job seekers to look through jobs, for employers to post jobs. So I think governments are moving in that direction, and you know, it might be through a user interface versus the crushing level of detail that's found here. But I think the Job Bank app, the release of the Job Bank app over the past month or month and a half shows that the government of Canada is moving in that direction.
Hi there. I'm not sure this comment's last question adds to our conversation, but an earlier point you made about, you know, how do we look at digital skills as, you know, do we put it in one particular classification or spread it out? And it got me thinking a conversation I had with my colleague during the break, Jordan, which is, are we perhaps narrowly construing that digital skills and innovation applies just to STEM? I think of companies like PayPal, LinkedIn, and Slack and Apple were started by people with degrees in philosophy and backgrounds in philosophy, no STEM education at all. And I think that sometimes we need to think about how those people, those skill sets are taking digital skills and digital learning, applying to their own disciplines, and really coming up with some really cool, innovative products. So rather than try to, you know, very government-like, and I'm a civil servant, you know, put it into a silo, it's looking at how it connects with all kinds of different disciplines and how those can be leveraged. Thanks.
So I love that question. And before we answer that, it's a great segue to the next thematic discussion that we want to have. Like, it's brilliant. And so then you can address that, perhaps. And it was this idea of considering the digital transformation across the entire economy. Can new digital skills effectively be added to an existing taxonomy or framework, or do we need to sort of like blow up the whole thing and start over? Like a new approach to taxonomy or skill identification, because what we're basing the NOC on are updates to a framework that existed prior to a digital transformation. So in other words, is the digital transformation so disruptive that we should start over blue sky thinking on how we do this, or can we continue to adapt an existing system to a new landscape? Questions to you, questions to the room, questions to the digital participants to think about that, think through that. I think we've got someone coming from the floor now to provide insight.
Well, I don't know if it's insight or not, but I'll try. I think it depends what we're trying to do. I think the NOC system is a great one for doing the research. And when I look at things like the NICE framework, it is a completely different way of looking at things, and it's adaptive and it changes. So it might be, maybe it's not nice, but it's a nice-like one. And it's something that, you know, there's a place for this, but maybe we do have another framework that complements it. So again, it just depends what we're trying to do. And you're right, I don't think industry will use this. When I worked in private sector, the only time I used NOC is when I was applying for federal funding or a federal program. So I think we have to come back to what's our objective, what are we trying to do, and then go from there. That's my take.
Yeah, maybe David, you could speak a bit more about how the NOC system can tie in and actually inform these other frameworks.
So what's interesting about the skills taxonomy and its interrelation to the NOC, so the taxonomy, I talked about this kind of translator document, so it's not meant to, you know, it might move towards a standard down the road and I think we need to continue to consult and make sure that it's meeting the needs of our stakeholders and of industry and of education. But I think it's also meant as a translator document of frameworks that exist today. So I think it's interesting, the self-organization around a certain industry. You kind of you kind of erected a structure to be able to talk through your industry. We're actually seeing that in a lot of different sectors of the economy where they've wanted to self-organize, really kind of ID what are the skills needs of our own industry, right? So we're hoping that the taxonomy can cut across and help us have that conversation. And this might be from a government perspective, but if there is an explosion in demand in one area and a contraction in another, do we have transferable skills? We want to have the transferable skills discussion, right? Can we slide individuals from one sector to another? I think that nationally, before we'd flush what we have, I think we can build on what we have, and we need more nimbleness in the system. I think that we're acknowledging that across the board, and but I do think that if we have that common structure, that's something that we're really focused on, trying to think about how can we have a common view of a national view of things while still meeting specific needs. I know that's kind of a broad-based answer.
So when we're looking at measuring what's happening in the economy, it helps to have a little bit of stability so you can do time series. So which sectors are growing, which sectors are not. So the labor force survey is going to a redesign. So we're probably looking at seeing if we can do some of the structural changes earlier, because I think they'll be done by 2019 in terms of their redesign. So changes to the NOC structure to be reflected for the next potentially 10 years on the labor force survey. We need to do them fast. And then also census 2021, so getting ready for that. So that's one side. But that doesn't mean that we can't have ways to either expand the classification below, so with the skills, for example, or cross-classifying by the skills. And yes, digital technology is everywhere. So in a sense, when we see the skills in the NOC, are we, do we have to just redefine the skills part of the NOC, what's already there? So we have a skills management, skills, different level, professional, things like that. And so does professional still have the same meaning, and what do we need to do in terms of changing maybe the skills language in the NOC? Yeah, thank you.
To your point, I think that's great, because if the digital transformation is economy-wide, and as we saw, there were only the two, food, cooking, and dishwashing, that are not digitally intensive right now. And my dishwasher is digitally intensive, so that doesn't count. Are we talking about digital skills, we as in someone who hasn't been working on the NOC, am I using the wrong word? Because, or is every skill in there stays the same, except for now it's acted within a digital medium? And so do we add a layer that explains that none of these skills profiles really have changed, just how we enact them within the economy has changed, how they're intermediated? Is that something we can put in? It doesn't sound like that's a skill, so how does that fit in? But maybe that gets to the ubiquity of digitalization. Thoughts, David?
I think that the intermediated in the economy is a great point, and I think it's a tricky question. I know that there were essential skills profiles. I mentioned that they've been updated over the course of 20 years. Is the rep from Skills Canada still in the room? It's okay. I think there were ESDC had funded some updates to around 17 essential skills profiles over the past year. So some of that information is coming out, mapping skills to particular occupations, but they are cutting across, and maybe it is just a question of, how is digital technology being reflected in this occupation? Maybe that's what you add to the base profiles. I think that makes a lot of sense.
are people happy with that solution? Should we send them back to work now and just say, add a intermediation? Wonderful question.
I just have an anecdotal story that Claire and I shared a taxi from the airport to the hotel yesterday, and the taxi driver didn't have a GPS, was, I'm going to say, probably over 65. And then when I went to pay, he said, let me just get my mobile phone with my little square gizmo thing. See, I don't even know what it's called. And you know, next thing you know, my receipt has been emailed to me. And so then we were, you know, just talking about how, you know, the conference that we're coming to is about digital skills. And look at you, Mr. Cab Driver, you have, you know, a level of skill that that I didn't have.
I think that's a wonderful anecdote because, you know, is that a new skill we add to under the transportation NOG taxi driver? Or is that just something, a level of digital fluency that is now expected of every occupation regardless? Is it something that can be identified? Or is it just, do we need a little asterisk at the beginning of NOC that all of these criteria apply in a digital environment?
So I think my question is kind of related. So the idea of digital intelligence that was in the paper that Dr. Gray did, have you guys thought about how or if that's going to be captured in the NOCs?
NOC isn't, it's capturing different occupations rather than intelligence, and it has some levels of skills in it, but it's not focusing as much on the skills as the digital skills taxonomy that we're working on. So if we were going to look at that kind of intelligence, and that's work in progress right now, we're developing it, that's probably where we would look at it in terms of the digital skills taxonomy.
My view about digital technology is that this is just a technology. This is a tool. When I'm reading a book on my pad, I'm still reading. Whether it is on a pad, a screen, or on a paper, this is just a tool. Look at a mechanician. A mechanician, when Ford created the first automobile, he was working with tools. Today's tools are no longer in steel. Tools are in electronics. They plug the stuff, they don't know what the stuff is doing, and they just look at what the screen says to them. It's just a tool. Now it's just a matter of using it properly. What I already talked to David about that. This is what I need to see in your evolution in the definition of NOC and Booker and whatever. I want to see the evolution within each occupation. Because I remember 2 years ago when I asked, okay, what type of occupation disappeared because of technology? Because I heard somebody said, oh, there's 21 occupations that disappeared. Show me. I want to know. No, nobody was able to really tell me that. Because occupations are still there, it's just the way the occupation is done that has changed. So just make sure that when you do that evolution, the review on an ongoing basis, like every year, that we see how the occupation has evolved and what type of skills. Is it level 1 or level 5? So I think this is the important part of it. It's like the literacy aspect. Can I live with literacy number 1, or do I need literacy 5 to be able to work now? So yeah, just make sure that you keep that.
I was just going to say it touches on Dr. Gray's point this morning about basic versus advanced digital skills application, right? So perhaps, you know, most, if not all, occupations require basic knowledge of digital skills to be able to function in today's economy. And then when you get to advanced technical skills, maybe we need to better define, not to be philosophical, but I was thinking about complementary skills. So we were talking about how do we attach the digital skills conversation to all NOCs because of it, right? The pervasiveness. But then I was thinking about what about taking, you know, we often hear from the ICT sector pointing out to us firms in the ICT sector saying, we're at the front, you know, cutting edge of changes in the economy. We need more support for digital skills training, that kind of thing. But should we be thinking about talking about those complementary skills, those thinking, problem solving, essential skills, and tying them to the ICT sector specifically? Like, it's kind of turning it up on its head a little bit, where it's like the ICT sector maybe should be also talking about, in addition to the advanced digital skills, maybe talking about those complementary skills that attach.
Just a small point on the data. In terms of occupations that are disappearing, you can look at the data. There are fewer town criers than there were 100 years ago, you know, and so on. Yes.
Yeah, I think there's a really great opportunity when we, even at the provincial level, because most provinces are running their own labor market information reports, statuses, also at the national level. I know from our research perspective, just out of general curiosity, we love tying those monthly reports back to the actual NOC in the province, because it's not always done automatically. Not that it shouldn't be, but it depends on who's releasing the labor market information. And you can see some really valuable evolutionary data trends through the labor market information tied to the NOC. And if, correct me if I'm wrong, but most of your past editions are archived. So there is that ability to, you know, go through page by page. And not that you should do that, but there is, you know, this data that's available in the NOC, I think is far, far more powerful from a planning and research perspective than the broader business community, academic community currently employs it. That's my perspective as a researcher, because over the years I just get deeper and deeper into it. And I remember, so I'm an economist by training, and while I used to work at a university, I never used this data. I went into the private sector, I'm using this data all the time. And I just, every year, my research gets that much more refined. And I'm thinking, hey, where was this 5 years ago? Oh, turns out you existed, I just wasn't using it.
So to build on that, people may not be aware that we do have concordances, which means these are theoretical concordances between different versions of the classification. So if, for example, now as we revise the national occupation classification, if we take one occupation A and divide it into A1 and A2 in the new classification, we'll have a concordance showing you that in 2016 it was this, in 2021 it has split into two. So you can do, you know, you can go back in time that way to the very first NOC that Stats Canada published data on. And also we are now in the process of developing a concordance, again, theoretical, not with data, but theoretical concordance between the National Occupational Classification of Canada and the SOC, which is the Standard Occupational Classification of the United States, and we will also have one with ISCO, which is the international one. Thank you.
We're going to move on to another topic. Oh, question. Wonderful. We're not moving on. Hold steady, everybody.
Sorry. My comment, I guess, I certainly agree with the digital focus. My comment is on the STEM, right? And let me preface my comments by saying that I have a degree in mathematics, and I worked in the community college system for 38 years, so I understand the importance of science, technology, engineering, mathematics. However, and I know that it's almost a buzzword these days, right? And if my wife was here, she'd probably kill me. She's doing a lot of research on STEM at the university level. But I'm fearful that with such an emphasis on STEM that we're going to forget everything else. And there's a lot of literature written now about STEAM careers, right? you know, science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, which to me includes every occupation there ever was or ever will be. So I'm not really sure why it's an emphasis on STEAM. And I'm a little, and I still have a conflict in my own mind about whether we should be singling out STEM careers versus non-STEM careers, because to me, I don't have it resolved in my own mind yet what we should be doing, but to me, I'm fearful that down the road, we're going to be sorry that we did this, and maybe it should be looking at all careers and inserting the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in the careers that they belong as part of the core values or the core competencies that are required for those careers. So it's not really a question, just my thoughts on it, I guess.
Actually, I'll have a question back to you then. So, so if we look at all occupations, and then would you then divide it into, say, theoretical, applied, let's say in the area of technology. So we're actually furthering the knowledge. You know, you're working in mathematics, you're furthering knowledge, or you're applying mathematics like in engineering versus maybe using it at a more basic level. So is that kind of categorization more useful to you?
Possibly, but I see most of the information that's coming from from NOC in particular, is around the data and the research that's being done and then fed back to people who are interested in it. So to me, you could do it that way if you wish, right? I'm not sure how I know as part of my Skills Canada hat that we go out to schools and we promote careers in skilled trades and technologies. So having a listing of all the careers that are available, certainly very useful to me and very useful to my organization. But again, whether we classify it as STEM related or non-STEM related, to me, it doesn't seem right, that's all.
Yeah, so this is a classification variant, which means it won't be part of the main classification.
Right.
So it's like a different perspective on the classification. And even here, even in the United States where this was first developed, you can see many variations in terms of the different US agencies, the different STEM categories or STEAM categories that they have. And so that's partly why we are thinking we should have something like a STEM mixed, because it's really, to just focus on the core STEM maybe doesn't make sense anymore.
I agree with everything that was said. That's all I have to say. No. Would this ability of, because the way STEM's being used now, I don't think it necessarily adds predominance to those particular industries, as it's just a way to categorize, a way to cut and dice the data to make it a little more digestible. So when you were talking about building a user interface, maybe, which I love, so here's all this data, here's this mess of data, extremely valuable, not very accessible. So what if you had this user interface that was very, like user-centered design on it? Could you add multiple categorical type variables? So like STEM, non-STEM, STEAM, and it could just like cut and dice and pull up as we went? I was just told the sky's the limit. Wow, I love that. That's a promise. We're taking that back in the recommendations.
Sky and budget.
Sky and budget. Yes. All right, what, you guys work for the government or something? Come on. Wonderful. So that kind of jumped to our sixth point, which was, should health occupations be included in STEM? But I think we kind of went broader than that and just, what's the value of having even STEM identifiers or different types of identifiers? But I do think from a processing understanding, it does make sense to have a multitude of possible categories to access the database through. Absolutely. Maybe we don't put so much emphasis on what's STEM and what's not, but rather what other categories could exist. Forget about, we could just call it traditional STEM, which emerged in the early aughts when digital was new. And it was just in those industries. Now that it's everywhere, we could have STEM, we could have, I can't think on the spot, I've got nothing else. But you could have a dozen.
There's always graphic design.
Graphic design, yeah. But, so one thing we noticed speaking with all industry and doing all that research was the business conversation does not use this vocabulary at all. That's an obstacle. We have the data for planning, program design. We have a standardized vocabulary for the data. It's not being used. And I hate to use this term, but in the real world. How do we overcome that? And whose responsibility is it to overcome? Do we just continue to say we need more education, get out there and teach people how to use this and teach people the difference between everything? Or is it the digital interface? Or just how do we overcome when the data is critical to strategic planning? If you're a business, if you're thinking 5, 10 years out about your workforce and where you should be investing, this can be very valuable information. But how do we make it accessible?
Yeah, I can start, but something you might find interesting. So employer job ads. So more and more employers are posting online, right? It's probably high 90s in terms of percentage of getting your jobs out there on the industry side. So we're looking at big data analytics and of collecting that kind of big data information on employer job ads. So obviously respecting where there's a big privacy piece, right? Especially if you have job seekers applying to these different pieces. But Indeed.com is a big job board across North America. We have the National Job Bank. So we do want to start studying the job ads and how employers are positioning that kind of skills information, what kinds, and we found that employers by and large often don't speak the language of skills. They speak the language of work activities, job tasks. And so that's maybe just an insight in terms of like getting into a culture of speaking, you know, really listing the types of skills you're looking for, that kind of thing. So anyway, we recently did a scan of 100,000 job ads through Indeed, and we just took a quick look to see, and that's what we found. We found that it was difficult to extract the skills related information, that it was really, they were embedded in those tasks. So I think that the taxonomy can help without constantly going back to the employer community. Like, I think that's an important piece to kind of hear from the employers themselves to describe what kinds of skills they need. I think that through different means, different ways of collecting that data, we can just start to see how they're positioning themselves, how they're positioning their ask.
So you're going to be able to reposition your deliverable in a way, in a language that business is already speaking?
One source.
One source.
Along with traditional surveys, focus groups, you know, I think we're going to need to use all these different methods to get a sense of how employers are, you know, presenting that kind of information.
So let me ask, so it sounds like you're taking a step towards bridging this gap. What would you like to see from the business community if they were to take a step to bridge this gap?
Actually, thanks to ESDC, I've had an opportunity to listen to what's going on in many other countries, and one of the things is that they're also finding this need for one standard taxonomy that can be understood by everyone. In some countries, I think it's in the Netherlands, they are actually training people to use a standard taxonomy. So they are helping people to write job ads and to also to write their own resume with these skills and to help measure these skills. So it's becoming, you know, very much more entrenched in some ways. So I'm not sure if Canada would go that way, and I won't speak for ESDC, certainly I don't think so, but you know, there are different approaches being taken. At any rate, even if everybody is not able to use this exact taxonomy, the best we can do is to make sure we communicate it really well so that people are aware of it, and also to have good sort of translation AI, you know, so we can actually take what's written, whoever writes it, and see if we can translate it to the standard skills taxonomy.
And there's a lot of blind spots at this point. I think we're still learning the space, but you know, little things. There's a research report out of I think it's Nesta. It's an organization out of the UK, and they were talking about using salary as kind of a proxy for skills proficiency. So the higher the salary tied to the work activity, can we extrapolate that, there's a real need for kind of, management positions to carry kind of a greater, a base of skills, or that they will be expected to perform those skills at a higher level. So, it's still early days, I think, but there are different pieces that we can start to examine.
So if a business needed help with this tomorrow, who can they contact?
We'll be around after the session. We'll pass out some business cards. So we're kind of a research shop, but I think that we're trying to connect with the Canada Business Network that runs out of ISED. Like again, early days, but I think that we will try to kind of connect. We have our regional offices, that kind of thing. So try to kind of get that information out. And obviously through the provinces and the territories. That's an important piece for us. As I mentioned earlier, there's big labor market transfers that go out to the provinces and territories, and they deliver skills training services. And I'm 100% confident about this in terms of partnerships that they build on the ground in the regions with the businesses. Your provincial territorial government representatives. I don't know if there are any in the room, but that's a plug for you who deliver the skills training services. I think that's a really good place to start as well.
Wonderful. You guys feeling good?
Feeling good.
Perfect. Any general questions, comments? We're beyond guided discussion now. We've gone into new territory. Online participants, anything coming from you? Adrian is almost falling asleep.
I really liked how you talk about with this classification system, the ability to understand when gaps come up in certain, or if there's industries that are diminishing as others are growing. And I'm wondering if you guys have thought about the way in which you design that could capture the emerging industries that come up. So thinking within the ICT sector, to say developer is a very broad term. You have junior, intermediate, senior, you have such a variety of different softwares. So I'm wondering in talking about an app interface, if there's a way to capture that information to demonstrate emerging industries and using this classification system as a tool to understand that.
Thank you for the question. I might have to get back to you also with a question. But so I'll address the industry side first. Okay, we have a North American Industrial Classification System. It's a classification that Stats Canada develops in partnership with the United States and Mexico. So you may have heard in the news, we're having a lot of challenges right now, but but we do have that classification. So that's how we measure industry. So if you're talking about this industrial sector, that industrial sector, that's how we measure it. I can't roll off the names right off my head, but that's what it is. But you are also talking about an app. And I was trying to say, were you looking to capture the skill levels with that app? Is that what you were talking about?
I think the skill level, and I'm just thinking like where you have things written here, like land survey technology and technicians.
Yes.
If that's going to become an emerging industry, how do I get more granular if I pick that as a career? Is there a way that you can design whichever way?
Yes, okay. So the NOC is at a fairly high level. So it doesn't go, but we do have something, ESDC has something called the Career Handbook that goes at a lower level, and do you want to speak to it?
Well, just the NOC has 500 unit groups, which covers kind of these terms right over here. The Career Handbook has close to 1,000, so it takes some of the NOCs and breaks them down into more detailed, like sub-occupational areas within the NOCs, and we call it the NOCs at the 4th digit. The Career Handbook will be at the 5th digit, and we're currently updating it. And that's where you'd find more detailed skills information. And we're looking to populate that now using the taxonomy as the backbone, as the anchor, in terms of the language that will be used profile by profile.
So that's what So that's what's used by career counselors. So I'm just supplementing what I know, I guess. So that is the tool that we have right now. As to whether it's up to date, whether it's using an interesting app like that, I think that's a great comment that we can take back to the, to the development of the career handbook.
At this point, I would like to thank David and Kavari for a wonderful presentation and for staying up here for about 45 minutes, answering questions you were not prepared for. You've done your departments a great service, and you should both be rewarded with an extra day of vacation. I do not have the power to give you that. Talk to your bosses about that. But please, thank you. It's wonderful.
Thank you very much.
And I was going to check in with online. If we go into wrap up comments, do you need to call back into WebEx, or can we continue and just wrap up? And Thomas is gone. We're going to wrap up. Online, I hope you stay with us for the next 10 minutes. So when we started today, we started with the general concept of the digital skills gap in Canada, focus on Atlantic Canada. We've come a long way in a very, I would say, unscripted manner to now having ESDC build an app that allows for career planning. So this is good. I love where this has gone. We've learned quite a bit. Some highlights that I love to pull out right now. One was from a comment in the panel, just to drive home the point of the patchwork of skills. As much as we keep talking about digital skills, the digital skills are inseparable from other skills. We should have stressed that. I should have stressed that in my presentation. It should have been stressed in the title of all of our presentations, that skills are inseparable, not just from infrastructure, but from other skills and from people. So there's really this patchwork approach, and maybe the discussion of digital needs to expand. Maybe you can't have a discussion of digital on its own anymore. I'm not sure where we're going to go with that tomorrow, but that was something that kind of rose to the surface today that made me think twice. The need for a shared lexicon, a shared taxonomy, we saw that in the problems of research in my presentation. We saw that with cyber, NB has taken the lead in that industry, that sector within New Brunswick to actually develop that shared vocabulary because they see the importance. We see David and Kavari and their departments working on that for Canada, but we also see from all the discussion how challenging that is. So we know we need it. We're not quite sure yet how to do it. We're not quite sure how we use it. Where do we go from here? Think it over tonight. We'll come back to that one tomorrow because I have nothing less to say on that. Digital intelligence was another point. And we saw that, one, we brought it up in the literature. We saw a lot of research that was highlighting a lack of digital intelligence. The way people were speaking of a gap would highlight more of an anxiety about digital transformation than it was an actual awareness of what was happening. And then in the panel with Kimberly White and Jeff Mullen of ACOA, where one of the biggest challenges he has with his clients is they don't know what they don't know, and they don't know where to turn to get the information about that. To me, that just comes full circle right back to digital intelligence. They know the world is changing. They know they need to change. They don't know where to start. I mean, that just drove the point home. I was seeing it from a research perspective. Here we're talking about local industry, local business participants, where that's a serious obstacle. So how do we approach the workforce of the future when we don't know what the future is? We don't know what we don't know. We don't know where to turn to get answers. We don't know what the consequences of the new technologies are we're developing. You know, Canada is a leader in artificial intelligence, like possibly the leader right now. We're drawing so much talent into Canada around this. I have no clue where this goes. No clue. It makes me anxious, but I have zero intelligence on that space. And this is something that from the basic skills right through to the more advanced skills, there's a lot we don't know. And that's starting to become evident in some of these discussions. So, you know, we could start the day with how do we plan new programs? And I'm almost coming back to thinking, I know I know less now than I thought I did in the morning. That's both scary and fun. Demographics was another one. Up until now, so I'm from New Brunswick, we've always talked about the aging workforce in the Maritimes as a huge risk factor. This huge cost, this huge explosion that's about to happen in the Atlantic region, the aging demographics, and how do we get this tied into digital skills and how do we train that? But then again, Jeff also pointed out there's an opportunity there. Do we train that? Or to what degree? Or do we view the succession, the generational succession, as the opportunity for a groundswell shift in digitalization? You know, how much effort do we put in to convincing someone to digitize their entire business operations when they plan on retiring in 3 to 4 years? Or do we help them find a succession plan and put that training into that succession plan? So all of a sudden, this aging demographic, this aging workforce in Atlantic Canada might not be such a risk to the digital workforce in Atlantic Canada. It might be a unique opportunity the rest of Canada doesn't have. We're about to just renew, maybe, if we can plan accordingly, not sure. If you're in that aging workforce and you think I've just pushed you out a little bit faster, I do apologize. But that's that. So tomorrow we're going to dive into some open discussions, some forums to explore all of these. Those were just a few takeaways I had from today's events. Again, like I said, I had no clue where we were going to end up today. It's a much richer discussion than I expected because I thought people were all going to come with, well, this is our program and we're sticking to it. Instead, everyone's come with an acknowledgement of the challenge at hand as well as the opportunity. And we're collectively taking a step forward. So with that, I'm going to finish talking for today. We're going to open a reception in the back of the room. So there'll be food. There's a cash bar to the side. We're going to have a keynote speaker, David Robitaille from IBM Canada, who will be speaking at, we're aiming for 5:45. The agenda says 6 o'clock. He has a flight out, and we have to allow time for the airport. So we're going to get him speaking at 5:45 p.m. So online participants, we're going to be connecting again. Everybody, let's unwind a little bit. Like I said, there's a cash bar. Let's just try to be here for 5:45. We'll catch up with IBM Canada to see their take on this, and then we'll reconvene tomorrow. So thank you all for your patience so far.